Hello to everybody. I want to welcome you all here. We're so excited to celebrate yet again another Siyum. It's very exciting these months. We get to see each other every once a month and get together and finish the Masechet together. So it's great having you all here. The more of you who want to open your video screens, it would be great to see everybody. So thank you all for coming. Today's Siyum is sponsored by Valerie Adler in honor of her niece, Dr. Ayelet Libson, who will be sharing with us an introduction to Masechet Ta'anit tonight, who we all admire, and Rabbanit Michelle for the inspiring Dapim so far. Mazal Tov to all, and thank you, Valerie, for sponsoring the Siyum. Okay, tonight we're going to first learn the end of the last daf. As usual, we'll do the Siyum. We will hear from Dr. Elana Stein Hain about the Shofar. Then we will hear from Dr. Ayelet Libson about the introduction to Ta'anit, and then we will get to hear from Mira Shapiro, who is one of our learners. Okay, we're going to get started learning the daf. So our daf today is daf lamed hey, and it's a very interesting way to end the Masechet. So we're going to start a little bit further back just to review. We had an interesting end to the Masechet, where the Masechet and the Mishnah, the very end of the Mishnah, kind of switched off. It was a little bit strange. It kind of went from talking about the shofar blows to this interesting machloka between Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis about davening, it seems like, okay? I want to first state that there's three different ways to understand what the Mishnah was referring to. So the Mishnah reads like this. We start with Rabban Gamliel, the rabbis say, Kashem shliach tzibor chayav, kach kol yachid v'yachid chayav. Just like the Chazan, person in charge of davening on behalf of everybody, is obligated, so is everybody else. Everyone has to daven on their own, which is what you would have expected. And in fact, we saw that you can't daven for somebody else. We talked about that before. You know, no one can daven for you in the morning. You have to do your own davening. So it obviously makes sense. But Rabban Gamliel has this approach. It's very interesting. And he says that shliach tzibor motzi et harabim yidei chovato. And people have a lot of issues trying to understand. Is he referring to davening every day? Is he referring to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur specifically? Is this Mishnah, this machloket, referring to Tkiyat Shofar even? Some people think that it's a reference to Tkiyat Shofar. This is in Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which recently went up on Sefaria. So if your Hebrew is good, it's not yet translated, unfortunately, but you can now find it on Sefaria easily. And he suggests it's actually talking about the shofar blast, which makes a lot more sense in the context of the Mishnah. Of course, doesn't make so much sense because what? There was a thought that everybody had to blow the shofar on their own. And he claims that, in fact, there really was. And if you remember, we learned earlier that in Yavne, everyone would take out their shofar and start blowing after. Remember when the Chazan finished, everyone would take out their own shofar. And he claims that we're just so biased, and the Rishonim were biased by what they saw happening, that nobody was blowing shofar on their own, that they couldn't possibly think that the Mishnah was referring to that. So I'm throwing out there that there's a bunch of different possible suggestions. Then we ended yesterday's daf with, or 2 days ago. I hope I'm not confusing people. By the way, if you're listening to this on podcast, you might get a little confused, especially if you're new and you just started learning Masechet Ta'anit today, which Baruch Hashem, many people started learning Masechet Ta'anit. So thank you for all those who helped with our campaign to get more people learning. It worked. And if you're learning Ta'anit and all of a sudden on the podcast, you're going to see Masechet Rosh Hashanah come up, you can listen, but don't get too confused. There was no way to organize it any better since Ta'anit started today and our Siyum was only now. Okay, so now we had Rabbi Bar Chana quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the rabbis ended up agreeing with Rabban Gamliel, which is fascinating because you would think that we kind of were all of the opinion that everybody has to daven on their own, but in fact they agree with Rabban Gamliel. And then we said that really Rav said no, they still disagree. And then we said even Rish Lakish, when he heard Rabbi Yochanan say it, he said no, they still disagree. And now we ended with this question. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chana from Tzipori, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabban Gamliel. We hold like Rabban Gamliel. Now when we say, again, this is all we do in the Gemara, we infer from statements that are made. Somebody said, we hold like Rabban Gamliel, that means that they mean that there's a machloket. Otherwise, you don't have to say we hold like someone if everyone agrees. So it must be that the rabbis disagree. Otherwise, and according to Rabbi Yochanan himself says this. So we're a little bit confused. On one hand, Rabbi Yochanan seems to say they all agree. The rabbis agree with Rabban Gamliel. On the other hand, he seems to say, no, we hold like Rabban Gamliel, but the rabbis disagree. So we're just trying to figure that out. So starting now with Lamed Hey. Kislik Rabbi Abba miyame pirsha. When he came from the sea, Rabbi Abba. Remember, we learned about the people would go to the sea, and that's where they would learn all sorts of things because it was the port. And in a port city, you hear lots of different things. You meet people from different places. So when he came back from there, he explained, Pirsha. Modim chachamim el Rabban Gamliel bebarachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim. When the rabbis agreed, it was only regarding Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, meaning Yom Kippur of the Yovel year. Okay, it was only regarding those tefillot. He makes a very easy distinction. He says we're going to distinguish between the regular days of the year and the days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then we can say, Shliach Tzibor is motzi. He can basically cover your tefillot. You don't actually have to daven on Rosh Hashanah, that long davening. Okay, I said last night at the Siyum and Ranan, whenever we got to shul on Musaf Rosh Hashanah, when it got up to shul, my father would make a joke when I was little and say, "I'll pick you up, tonight," because I would always, took me a long time to get through all those words when I was younger. So he used to make a joke that it's the longest davening there is. So it makes sense. And a davening like that, we can have somebody fulfill our obligation. But the rabbis still disagree with Rabban Gamliel when it came to everyday prayers. So now the Gemara, it sounds like a good answer. However, what happened now? But wait, and this is classic in the Gemara. It's a very nice suggestion, but it doesn't work because now we have another statement that Rabbi Chana Tzipora said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Here you have it. You can't say that because he specifically said in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we hold like the rabbis. So we hold like Rabban Gamliel, which means the rabbis obviously disagree with him on that. So it was a very nice theory, but it doesn't work. So Ella Amarav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, a creative answer. Man Modim, who's the one who agrees? When he said the rabbis in the earlier statement of Rabbi Yochanan, when we said Rabbi Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the rabbis agreed, he wasn't talking about all the rabbis. He was talking about someone in particular. Who in particular? Rabbi Meir. We now have almost three categories. There's Rabbi Gamliel. He disagrees with the rabbis. The rabbis don't agree with him. They end up disagreeing forever. And Rabbi Meir comes in and he says, I agree with Rabbi Gamliel. How do we know this? It's not just coming out of the blue, but we have a source like everything else today, right? We pull out sources to knock out answers. Here, we're going to pull out a source to prove our answer. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Brachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim, Shliach Tzibur Motzi Rabim Yedei Chavatan Divrei Rabbi Meir. Here you have Rabbi Meir says exactly what Rabban Gamliel said. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and then it's specifically Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he agrees, not all prayers. The Shliach Tzibur is Motzi the Rabim Yedei Chavatan. Okay, he helps those all fulfill their obligation, and individuals don't actually need to pray. The Chachamim Obrim, and the rabbis obviously disagree. So now comes the big question. Ma'ishna, what's the difference? Hane. If it's because there's so many verses, remember we learned 10 verses or 7 verses or 3 verses, and not everybody knows. Remember, in the days where there were no Sidurim, it was very complicated. You had to get up to daven and you had to know 10 verses of Malchio, 10 verses of Shofar, right? I'll test you all. Do you know 10 verses of Malchio? Could you give me 10 verses of Shofar, right? Not so simple. So, right, especially without a computer in front of you to kind of Google it. Now it might be a lot easier to do this with Safari or some other kind of search engine, which obviously you can't use on Rosh Hashanah when you're in shul trying to figure this out. So in any case, we're going to say maybe because of that. But something very surprising, especially in light of things that we learned, okay, we pass this down in the name of Rav, that what? As long as you say, if you don't know psukim, it's okay. You don't actually need 10 verses. You don't need 7 verses. You don't even need 3 verses. You can just say in the Torah, it says. And some people claim not just in the Torah, you'd have to say in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, and in the Ketuvim, because remember, you need from each section. Whether you say that or that, but the point is, all you need to say are those 3 words, you don't need to say any more. You don't need all the verses. Now, this seems very strange. Remember, we said you can't do any less than 10 or 7 or 3. So how all of a sudden do we not need any verses? So first of all, many people think that this was actually said originally for Musaf in general. Musaf is a prayer where we list all the sacrifices done that day. And in fact, in certain Sephardi communities, they actually don't say all we say in Ashkenazi communities and in some Sephardi communities, we say in the Musaf, we list all the sacrifices that we bring. In some communities, they only say Ubetoratcha Katuv Lemor, and they don't actually say it. And part of the reason is there's a concern that you're actually going to say the wrong thing. And since our prayers are in place of sacrifices, we don't want you to mess up and say the wrong thing. So as a result, they just say it very simply, and it says so in the Torah, and kind of like look there. And you'll find all the details there. And they don't actually say it in the Dav. So that's what he says here. The same thing would apply for Rosh Hashanah. Now, how could it apply for Malchiyot, Zichronot, and Shaparot? So some people claim, again, it's a little bit, it's difficult in light of what we saw before. Some people claim that only if you start saying verses, do you have to then do the minimum number. But if you actually don't start, you can suffice with just this statement. It's very interesting. So in any case, it seems like that's not the biggest deal because you can really get away with saying just, and in the Torah it says. By the way, you could maybe distinguish Chazan versus individual. Maybe the Chazan has to do all the psukim, but if you're an individual, maybe they give you a break because they know it's not so easy. So in the end, they say, Elamishum da avshe brachot. It's because there's a lot of brachot. Okay, avshe can be interpreted in two ways. One is a lot of brachot. One is it's very loud from all the brachot and all the people praying, and it's hard to focus. And maybe you won't be able to focus properly. It's a little bit strange to say that. Didn't they daven Shemon Esrei silently? But maybe this is a source that maybe they did it out loud. And also there was Chauffeur going in the middle of davening. It was distracting. And maybe because of that. So either which way, there's something different about this. Either it has a lot of blessings, even if you don't have to say all of the verses, you still have a lot of blessings. So Malchiyot, you have Zichronot, you have Shofar. It's atypical. And because of that, Rabbi Meira ends up agreeing with Rabban Gamliel that you don't need to. And he distinguishes between a regular davening and Rosh Hashanah davening. Gufa. Now the Gemara wants to go a little bit more in depth into the statement that Rav Hananel said. Amar Rav Hananel Amar Rav, Kevan she'amar b'toratcha katuv lemo, shuv eino tzarich. You don't need to say any more than that. Savur mina, they thought, and this is what I suggested before, maybe this is only for an individual and not the community. Of course, the rabbi, the chazan, the cantor has to say everything. But in fact, that's not true. Whenever we see savur mineh, right? These are key words that you're going to start to get used to. Savur mineh always means they thought, and eventually they're going to be proven wrong. And in fact, they're proven wrong here. Itmar, it was said, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, echad yachid, echad tzibur, kevan she'amar b'toratcha katuv lemo, shuv eino tzarich. Even in the community setting, the chazan can get up and say, Toratcha katuv lemo, and done, right? That would make our davening much, much shorter on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Although it's not the only long part of our davening, right? We've added many additional piyutim, right? All these songs that we add. So it's not actually the longest part of davening, but it would make it a little bit shorter. Now we get to another section. Now we talked before about there was a debate between Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis about this shliach tzibur, and then they said right about the individuals, and then they said, well, according to you, Rabban Gamliel, why do individuals pray if they don't really need to? And he said it's so that the chazan can put together his prayers in his head. It's to buy him time, basically, so that he can go over his prayer. So now on that topic, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Olam yastir adam tfilato v'achar kach yitpalel. Any person who gets up to daven, again, this is in times without a sitter, should put together your thoughts. I mean, it's not even a bad idea if you have a sitter, but to put together your thoughts before you pray, collect your thoughts, know what you're going to say, go over the words, and only after that should you pray. Amar Rabbi Abba, but Rabbi Abba said, "Misaber milta de Rabbi Elazar b'brachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim v'shel prakim, aval de kol hashana lo." He says, I think he's really only referring to special days, but the everyday prayers, everybody knows them, and you don't need every day to go through your prayers and check. These are things that we already know. We know them by heart. It's not an issue. It's only on things that happen once a month, once every few months, once a year, etc. So now the Gemara questions that, Ini, and they question it from a rabbi. And what he did, V'harav Yehuda, mitzader slote umatzle, he would organize his prayers every time before he davened. So you would think maybe he's going beyond the letter of the law, right? That would be the easiest explanation. But instead of saying that, the Gemara gives a very shocking explanation, although those who learn Masechet Brachot might remember this. Shane Rav Yehuda, kevan demitaltin yomen betaltin yomen havamatzle kiprakim dame. Since he would daven only once every 30 days, his daily prayer was like something that only happens once in a while. And he had to do that because he only prayed once every 30 days. What do you mean? He didn't pray every day, 3 times a day, right? What kind of rabbi doesn't pray 3 times a day? So in fact, there's a halacha that if your Torah is your job and that's all you do, you're actually exempt from praying. And he actually, according to the Gemara here, he actually didn't pray. He only prayed once every 30 days. Why once every 30 days? Not sure, although it's very nice that our Masechet is ending with things that happen once every 30 days. That's how we started with the cycle of the moon. And, maybe he davened Rosh Chodesh, who knows, right? Maybe that was the once a month that he would daven, right? So hard to imagine Rav Yehuda, who was second generation Amoraim. He's always quoting from Rav and Shmuel. He was Talmid of both of the great rabbis. And yet he was such a strong student that he actually didn't daven. So for him, he had to organize his prayers because it didn't come so easily to him. Okay, last section of today's daf, a very interesting way to end our Masechet. Amar Rav Acha bar Ravira, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Poter haya Rabban Gamliel afilu am shebesadot. Now, there's a lot, I'm not going to get into all the details here, but there's a lot of confusion a little bit about when Rabban Gamliel said that the Shliach Tzibor fulfills the obligation for everyone, who exactly is he referring to? And here we have Rabbi Shimon Chasida saying that he didn't only mean, you might have thought he meant everyone in the building, right? Whoever's there, they don't really need to daven. The Shliach Tzibor is covering their prayer for them. And in fact, those who say, because we paskin like Rabban Gamliel, is that only works, by the way, if you're listening and you have to hear every word. But comes Rabbi Shimon Chasida and he says, and in fact, many poskim say, this is why we don't hold like this anymore, because nobody could possibly concentrate on listening to every single word. And all the more so, because in our repetition of Shemona Esrei on Rosh Hashanah now, we've added so many extra things, right? That it's true, right? It's impossible to concentrate on every single thing the Chazan is saying. So therefore, you can no longer count on relying on Rabban Gamliel nowadays, because we wouldn't be able to really listen to every word. You'd have to listen to every word. But Rabbi Shimon Chasida obviously had a bit of a different idea. And he says, Poterei Rabban Gamliel, afilu am shebesadot. Now, what he seems to be saying is not only the people in shul, not only the people in the city, but even people who maybe could hear or at least are close by, but even people that are out in the fields. Some people say, what are they doing out in the fields on Rosh Hashanah? Well, first of all, people did guard fruits on Rosh Hashanah. So it could be that they were out in the fields on Rosh Hashanah guarding the fruits. Some people say that maybe he was talking about a weekday, but it doesn't really seem that way. But he claims that the people out in the fields, even they're included in the prayers of the Chazan. To which the Gemara says, 1 minute, right? And that doesn't include, obviously he means afilu. The words, again, we're going to be very careful about the wording. Even, which means even obviously the people in the city and even the people in the fields. But then the Gemara says, adrabah, it should be the exact opposite. Those people out in the fields are stuck. They have no choice. But the people in the city who don't think it's important enough to go to shul, so right, they could get there, they just don't. They're going to be exempt from the Chazan's tefillah by sitting in their house. That seems absurd. Says, just like he says, if you're in shul, when they're doing Birkat Kohanim, they're duchening the Kohanim, and you're in the hallway, or you're behind the Kohanim, you don't get the bracha. You have to be in front of them. If you're not bothering to go into the room where they're giving the bracha, you don't get a bracha. And likewise here, if you're going to be in your house, in the city where there's a shul, and you don't go to shul, of course you're not going to be covered. So they basically say, Ela ki ata Ravin, when Ravin came from Israel and passed on what had been said, Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, he said the name of Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, instead of Rav Acha bar Avira, who said the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida, someone else passed down the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, lo patar Rabban Gamliel, ela am shebesadot, not afilu, ela. They're the ones who Rabban Gamliel said. Rabban Gamliel said, the Shliach Tzibor's prayer can now, right, forget about the fact that we discussed the other day, right, how could you possibly wake up in the morning and say to my friend, can you pray for me? So according to Rabban Gamliel, you can't have your friend pray for you, but you can have the Shliach Tzibor pray for you. Only though if you're in shul and listening, it seems like, again, there's different ways to understand it. So I'll kind of say a way of looking at it, but it is open to interpretation. Or if you're not in shul, but you couldn't get there because you had some issue, right? You broke your leg and you can't make it to shul, or you were out in the fields, whatever it is. In the fields is just an example. Then it will cover you. My time, mishum da'ani sebe melacha, aval be'ir lo. But if you have no excuse, you can't have your prayers covered. And this is the way the Masechet ends. A really, really interesting way to end the Masechet. I'll say the words Hadran alach Yom Tov, Masechet Rosh Hashanah. We finish the parak of Yom Tov, and we finish with that Rosh Hashanah. But I want to add here a little bit. I want to talk about what this is, what's going on here, and I want to do a little bit of a summary of our whole Masechet, a bit of a perspective, and a lead into Masechet Ta'anit. So if you look at the similarities between Rosh Hashanah and Ta'anit, there's something interesting about the juxtaposition, right? We would have expected Rosh Hashanah, Yoma, right? Yom Kippur should have come, then Sukkah, then maybe Beitza, Yom Tov in general, and then Ta'aniyot. What are Ta'aniyot? They're fast days. We're going to hear more from the Ayelet today, but they're fast days that are instituted for the public when there's a public issue, right? There's no rain, there's some other issue, and they're public fast days. So what's the similarity between both of them? Both Rosh Hashanah talks about the new moon. It's a natural phenomenon. And the fast days talk about rain, which is a natural phenomenon. But both of them need human intervention, right? We need to pray for rain. That's going to be the theme of Masechet Ta'anit. We need to we need to declare the new moon. That's up to us, right? The world was created on Rosh Hashanah, but it's up to us to do tshuva every year, right? Both the theme of tshuva, of tefillah, tzedakah, all those, that's a big theme, both in Rosh Hashanah and in Ta'aniyot. So they're very, very similar, more similar than you would have thought at first glance. However, there's a very big difference. And I already said that they're called Ta'aniyot Tzibor, which is communal fasts. And we've talked about this throughout the Masechet. There's a certain role that the individual is playing here. There's a lot of interplay, both in this Masechet and the next one, about Yachid and Tzibor, and when things apply to an individual and when they apply to a community. And what I want to show you is that in Ta'aniyot, it's going to be more of a focus on the community, and in Rosh Hashanah, it's more of a focus on the individual. And I'll give you a few examples. We saw that the first main example is everybody passes before God, kivnei marom, right? Like sheep, or there were different explanations of it, but we all get judged individually on Rosh Hashanah. We had the Re'iyah and the Shmi'ah. We talked about the seeing the new moon and the hearing the new moon. Even though the court declares the new moon, it's really only if witnesses come forward. And we talked about the whole importance of every individual witness coming and not deterring them from coming. We talked about the Yedei Moshe, that he had to hold his hands up. And we talked there about how it was all about it wasn't like the version of the Mechilta that was all miraculous. It was, no, if people looked up and they were focused and they were concentrating on God, that's what brought it about. And the Masechet keeps focusing on the individual's role. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that it ends with the importance of the individual. Every individual, unless you're, anus and you can't help it. But if you can, you have to pray, right? You can't rely on someone else taking care of it for you. And then there was this issue, and the fast days, we talked about how it's a knufiyah, it's a gathering of people. The whole idea, they go out into the middle of the city and they're going to pray there. And it's very much about the tzibur, the community. And if you remember, we already saw a whole bunch of comparisons. One, for example, was I believe it was in the daf just before, which was about, are the brachot ma'agvot, right, on Lamed Daled, and the tefillot, right, the tzkiot, how they don't, right, on Rosh Hashanah, you have to do it exactly so. On Ta'aniyot, it's okay. If you skipped a bracha, you skipped a shofar blast, it's not so important. So what's this comparison? I think that there's the idea, and I think it's apropos that Rosh Hashanah leads into Ta'aniyot, because in order to work as a community together, we all first need to work on ourselves. And when we work on ourselves, we have to be very exacting. We have to do it just so and do it just right and have our own way of doing it. When we're a community, right, we saw that you don't have to have as much kavanah and davening if you're in the community. You can get away with things because we have the strength of community. But as an individual, you can't rely on that. And I think that there's an idea here that first you need to work on yourself as an individual, and after that, you can then give to the community. And that's why first we have Rosh Hashanah, which is almost, right, as much as we think of Rosh Hashanah, this is an amazing day and very important, but it's almost like it's preparing you for life. It's this one unique day a year that really prepares you for the rest of the year and gives you the tools that you're going to need to be part of a community and be with them. I want to quote you a quote from Natan Sharansky's book, Fear No Evil. And in the end of his preface, he says the following, and it's exactly this idea. So I'm going to read to you now. He talked about how he grew up in a generation where his parents basically assimilated. That was their idea, to try to blend in and leave their Jewish roots behind. And he talks about the difference between their generation and what he learned. And he said, for the activist Jews of my generation, our movement represented the exact opposite of what our parents had gone through when they were young. But we saw what had happened to their dreams, and we understood that the path to liberation could not be found in denying our own roots while pursuing universal goals, right? He's talking about this idea of the individual versus the universal. On the contrary, we had to deepen our commitment, because only he who understands his own identity and has already become a free person can work effectively for the human rights of others. It's exactly that concept. And the next line, you'll be amazed, he says, in Israel, when I was writing this book, I came upon an image by the American writer Cynthia Ozick that captures this idea perfectly. You ready? The shofar, the ram's horn, that is sounded in the synagogue on the high holidays is narrow at one end and wide at the other. Remember, we had the whole sugya, you can't change it and flip it. Nothing happens if you blow into the wide end, but if you blow into the narrow end, the call of the shofar rings loud and true. And there's this beautiful idea about going through the narrow end, through the individual, and that's what makes the shofar blast wider at the end and to be able to capture everyone. And I thought I could think of no more beautiful image for what I see in front of me today with all of your beautiful faces and all of the learning that's surrounding us, and the idea about how each of us in our learning is deepening our individual commitment to Judaism, to our traditions, to learning, to understanding, but you can't, the community that we've created and that we all feel such a strong part of is, our individual, the fact that we've worked on ourselves as individuals allows us to be part of this beautiful community. So thank you for being part of it. And with that, we will now say the Hadrans together. I'll share my screen. Okay, everybody ready? Here goes. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'hadrach alan. Da'atan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'da'atach alan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon mofanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu shetehe toratcha umanutenu ba'olam hazeh utehe imanu la'olam haba. Hanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Adar bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befinu ufipiyot amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu, kulanu, tze'etze'enu, v'tze'etze'e amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yod'ei shemecha v'lomdei toratcha lishma. Me'ovai techakmeni mitzvotecha, ki la'olam hi li. Yehi libi tamim b'chukecha, leman lo evosh. La'olam lo eshkach pikudecha, ki bam chiyitani. Baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha. Amen, 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 sela va'ed. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Elohai, kashem she'azartani l'sayem Masechet Rosh Hashanah, ken ta'azreni lahatchil mesechtot usfarim acherim u'lesaymam, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות, ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו, שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו בהתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, בהקיצותה היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. אשר כוח, מזל טוב לכולם שמסיימות. Thank you to all excited that we're finishing together. Mazal tov to everybody who finished. Okay, I'm now very excited to be able to introduce Dr. Elana Stein Hain, who's the Director of Faculty and the Senior Fellow at the Shalom Harper Institute of North America. She's very passionate about bringing rabbinic thought into conversation in contemporary life. She actually has a great series called Talmud from the Balcony, which is the idea of kind of taking something we don't always get to do at Daf Yomi. We try to do it at the Siyums, but kind of taking a perspective from up above in the balcony and getting into the broader ideas that come up. And she'll be talking to us today right now about Shofar as the quintessential ritual. And she also, by the way, has an upcoming book based on her doctoral dissertation, which analyzes legal loopholes in rabbinic law. So, Elana.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Farber. Does this mean I have to stop crying long enough to present something that was absolutely beautiful? And I don't think we could have planned it better, because I actually want to focus on the wider side of the shofar. And I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you to think about something for a minute. And if you want, you can hit the reaction button and raise your hand if you feel like it. How many of us, put yourself in a Rosh Hashanah mindset, you're listening to the shofar. How many of us, when we hear the shofar, hear crying? How many of us, when we hear the shofar, we hear an alarm, like a wake up? How many of us, when we hear shofar, do we think about Akedat Yitzchak? How many of us, when we hear the shofar, do we think about revelation, like at Sinai, or a future redemption? How many of us think about coronating God as sovereign over the universe? Now, let me ask you a question. If you're sitting in one seat and you're thinking about one of those themes, and someone else is sitting in another seat and they're thinking of a completely other theme, maybe even opposing themes, right? The crying and the clarion call. Are you doing the same thing? The public nature of shofar is actually deeply ambiguous, and it's deeply multiple. We're doing one activity. It has no words to it except the words we put around it. But the actual ritual itself has no words to it. You wouldn't be able to listen to it on its own and know what it means. And in fact, you could even think of it as a musical instrument. And I like to argue that it's precisely because shofar has so many different interpretations that can exist side by side in our own heads as we sit next to each other or stand next to each other in shul, that it is the perfect example of a ritual. It does precisely what ritual is supposed to do. What ritual in many ways is supposed to do is provide a focal point for people to share in relationships. And I'll tell you a little bit more. There's a wonderful sociologist named Adam Seligman, and he suggests that there are two types of self. There's the sincere self, which is what you're thinking, what you're feeling right now. So maybe you're feeling tired, maybe you're feeling hungry, maybe you're feeling happy, maybe you're thinking about something that you need to do after you get off this call. But then there's the ritual self, which is the performance that you're doing. Now, if I look on this screen, you're all doing the same thing, ostensibly. Your performance, what you're doing on the outside, is the same. You're looking at a screen, you're taking notes, you're thinking, you're learning, but I have no idea what's going on in your sincere self. The ritual, the performance of coming together and doing this together creates an ability to share this space without having to know how Elisheva in particular feels about this moment, or without having to know what Jordana in particular thinks is going on. It's actually dafka, an ambiguous space. And the reason we can all show up here is because we each are allowed to have our own interpretation of the space, even as it is shared with everyone else. I want to give one more example of how this works, let's say in relationship. In general, if you try to maintain a relationship with anyone or with any institution only based on sincerity, on how you feel, that would fail, right? Try living with someone and never offering to do the laundry, never offering to wash the dishes, never offering to take out the garbage, right? Try going to work only when you feel like it, right? There's actually the way that relationships are maintained, whether it's relationships between people and God or relationships between people and each other, are not just on the basis of sincerity, what am I feeling right now, but they're on the basis of shared activities, actually shared activities. And I think that the shofar represents this beautifully. You can say, I love you to someone when you don't really feel it, but you know you need to say it because that's what's going to maintain the relationship. That's the ritual self. That's a performance. You're doing a performance that allows the two of you to be together. You can also say, I love you when you really feel it in your own sincere way. And that's when you wait to say, I love you, right? The shofar is the quintessential ritual self. And I want to give you an example of how I think the Gemara itself in Rosh Hashanah, I'm already a few Masechet ahead apparently, how the Gemara itself actually tests the limits of how much of an action shofar is versus how much shofar is each one of us being able to say, this is what I think about God being sovereign over the universe right now. This is what I think about my need to do tshuva. This is what, right? The fact that it's, even when it's a cacophony of shofar, by the way, even if you wanted to have everybody blow their own shofar, it doesn't matter. The sound is the same. The sound is the same, but the meanings are so, so different. So I want to call your attention to a moment in Rosh Hashanah that you'll surely remember. And for those who learn brachot, you'll also remember a different shade of this conversation, which is the Gemara is talking about whether mitzvot require kavanah, whether mitzvot require intention. Now, what kind of question is that? Of course, mitzvot require intention. Isn't the whole point that you're developing your relationship with Hashem, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with others? What is that question even? So I want to think about these two selves, the self that actually will do something with others where there's a lot of interpretive possibility, but it retains the relationship, maybe because you don't always express the differences of your interpretation, maybe because you always do it even when you're not exactly feeling it, but it's the action itself that does something. I want to think about how that actually speaks to the Gemara's discussion of whether mitzvot require kavanah, and specifically shofar. I'm going to share my screen for a minute, and I'm cognizant of time, so we'll make sure to do this in all the right amount of time. For anybody who's interested in the Adam Seligman, we'll have that available for you another time, but I want to look at our Gemara right now, okay? The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Kafchet Amud Aleph to Kafchet Amud Bet, goes like this. Shalchu le'avua de Shmuel. They sent the message to Shmuel's father, Kvo v'achal matzah yatza. If somebody forced you to eat matzah, I know some of us feel like we're always forced to eat matzah, but if somebody forced you to eat matzah, you were yotze your mitzvah. You achieved the mitzvah. Kvo man, who forced them? Ilema kvo shade, if you say that a demon forced them, meaning some sort of like internal force. V'hatanya, don't we learn? Itim chalim, itim shote, kishu chalim hareo kibikeach l'chol dvarav, kishu shote hareo kishote l'chol dvarav. If this person was sort of like felt compelled because they were having a manic episode, well, that doesn't count as eating matzah. Don't we learn that somebody who's sometimes lucid, sometimes has the status of a shota, there's something going on there mentally that's not working right, that if they're having an episode, that doesn't actually count. So it can't be that they were forced by some internal, episode. So Amar Rav Ashi says, shekfa'u parsim. Parsim, some people say it means Persian, some people say other things, but somebody forced you to eat matzah. So here you are, you're not thinking, I want to eat matzah. This is my sincere remembrance of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and I'm thinking about all the people who came out. You're literally just being forced to eat matzah. You put it in your mouth. You're Yotze. You fulfilled your mitzvah. Amar Rava says, well, you know what I think then? Hatokei l'shir yatza. Then if you're just blowing a shofar to make music, you should also be Yotze. Because after all, it's just an action. You're just doing an action. Pshita hainuha, aren't they the same thing? Ma'u detema, what would we have thought? Hatam echol matzah amar Rachmana. The Torah just said, eat matzah. And you ate it, whether you were forced or you weren't forced, but you did it. Aval hacha, but here, when it comes to shofar, zichron truat ktiv, it says you have to remember It's a remembrance, some mental energy, some, emotional investment, right? Cognitive investment, even. It's a remembrance of a blast. K'tiv, it said, this person is just fiddling around with a shofar. So, Kamash Malan, this is coming to teach us, no, you could eat matzah, being forced and biyotze, and you could blow shofar just for music and biyotze. Alma kasavar Rava, mitzvot ein tzrichot kavana. Sounds like Rava doesn't think you need kavana for mitzvot. You don't need intention. It's okay if you're playing for music and that counts as shofar. It's okay if you're eating because somebody forced something into your mouth and that counts for matzah. So, but wait a second. We have another source, which those who learned Brachot will remember this Mishnah. Haya koreh Torah v'higi azman hamikra. If somebody was reading in the Torah, you happen to be somewhere near Parshat Ve'et Hanan, and Kriyat Shema, time for Kriyat Shema comes. Im kivein libo, if that person had intention, yatsa, they can fulfill the mitzvah of Shema by just reading it there. V'im lav, and if not, lo yatsa, you don't fulfill. So doesn't that sound like you need kavanah? You need intention? My love, kivein libo latze, aren't we saying you need intention in order to fulfill the mitzvah? Like, meaning you need intention. I am here intending to fulfill a mitzvah, right? You need that. It's not just, no, that's not the kind of intention you need. Likrot, you just need intention to read, to actually know that you're reading. Likrot, to read. Bakakari, but you are reading. The Korela Hagia, you were reading to fix the Torah scroll, and now you're really going to read and enunciate all the words, right? I want to even just pause here. This conversation, that you look at shofar, and what do you see? You could see shofar as you're just playing an instrument, just like you could see matzah as you're just downing some food. You could see even Kriyat Shema as you're just reading from a scroll, right? What the rabbis are asking is they're saying, well, if these things, if the action, if the ritual is really what's central, then why do you even need to be thinking about this as a mitzvah at all? Why not just say, as long as you did the action, it's fine. And what I'd like to end with is this bridge that we can imagine in our heads. There are actions that we do all the time without thinking about it. There are actions that we do that we are very, very meticulous about why we're doing this. Shofar is actually a third space because it's not just about me and what I'm doing. It's about we. I'm in shul on Rosh Hashanah, or by the way, to Rabbanit Farber's point on the last Amud, I'm in the fields and don't even hear the Shaliach Tzibor, right? But I'm thinking about how I relate to the bigger picture. And if that bigger picture is going to include me, it has to be ambiguous enough. It has to be open enough that Rachel could be thinking one thing and Yael could be thinking another thing and Madeline could be thinking another thing. And we're still all there as part of the same activity. It is something that is so lost in our Western culture today, where we all think it needs to be what I think, when I think, and only with the people who think like me. And yet there's a limit because it still needs to be in the context of a mitzvah, right? At the end, we actually do think that mitzvot require kavanah. It can't just be, well, someone's doing a performance and I'm thinking about this as a jazz performance and I'm thinking about this as, coronating God, sovereign of the universe. We don't go that far, right? But the question that Chazal even raise, could you go that far, focuses us on the importance of an action in order to connect. You come on this screen today, you could do the Siyum by yourself. You could listen to Rabbanit Farber because you want to be something bigger than yourselves. I go and hear Chauffeur and Shul because I want to be part of something bigger. And whether that part of something bigger is a relationship with God, regardless of how I'm feeling at that moment, or that something bigger is a relationship with others, or both, there's something about the public nature of Shofar. and the fact that it has both the narrow end and the wide end that I hope will carry us through as we continue to learn in community.
Wow, what a beautiful idea. Thank you, Elana. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Ayelet Hoffmann Libson, who is a scholar of Talmud and Jewish law. She's an associate professor at the IDC in Herzliya. She's been on the Gross Visiting Professor of Talmudic Jurisprudence at Harvard and Penn Law Schools. She not only has an academic hat to her, but also she's graduate of Matan's Advanced Talmud program and the Beit Mira Shapiro program in Jewish law. And she has a great mix of both academic Talmud study with traditional Talmud study. And she also authored a book, an excellent book called Law and Self-Knowledge in the Talmud. She's on her third cycle of Daf Yomi, if that's an inspiration to other people here. And what I'm really excited about is that not only is Ayelet going to speak at our Siyum today, but she's going to kick off a new series that's going to appear on our site, which before every Masechet, she's going to give us an introduction to the Masechet. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Ayelet.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Michelle and to Elana as well. I think, really the fact that all three of us thought to speak about the same themes definitely means that they're really there. We're not just making it up, okay? However, I do want to focus specifically on Ta'anit. And as Michelle already mentioned, the main theme of Masechet Ta'anit is rain and bringing rain and what happens when there is no rain and fasting for rain. So I'm going to share my screen and briefly look at a few sources. We won't really go into them in depth, but they'll just kind of accompany us as we go along. So already in the Torah and in general in the Tanakh as a whole, we can see that rain is a form of communication between God and between the people. Now, what's important to notice, I think, is that it's a kind of one-way form of communication, right? It's a vertical axis where God is conveying to the people, if you do the mitzvot and you do as you follow my commandments, then there'll be rain, and the rain will be according to specific seasons. Rain will fall in the right season and it won't fall in the wrong season. And if you don't do those mitzvot and you cause me anger, then the skies will be shut and there'll be no rain. So God is using rain as a form of communicating to the people if they're following the commandments or if they're not following the commandments. And we find this idea throughout all of the Tanakh. Many times there are droughts, and then the people understand that they need to do tshuva. And that's a very, very strong theological, prevalent idea. And the tractate as a whole, especially we see in the Mishnah, this idea that rain is a form of communication, and specifically also that there's a good time for rain, and if rain falls at the wrong time, then that's also a form of communication. That's a form of a curse. And we see that, sorry, why is this doing that? Okay, we see that already in the very first Mishnah of the tractate, where the Mishnah is talking about when you start asking for rain. And there's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua about, do you start asking for rain from the first day of Chag Sukkot or from the last day of Sukkot? And Rabbi Yehoshua says, why is my opinion that we start asking for rain only after Sukkot? He says, rain during Chag Sukkot is nothing other than a sign of a curse. Okay, so there's a specific time where rain is supposed to start falling, and that's only after Sukkot. And the chapter also ends, there's this literary method that the chapter uses, which is called Hachatima me'en hapticha, right? The signature of the chapter goes back to the beginning of the chapter and uses exactly the same term, where the Mishnah throughout this chapter talks about, it begins by saying there's an ideal time to ask for rain. But what happens if rain doesn't come? And it describes a process where at first the individuals begin asking for rain, and gradually the fasts develop to the whole community, so that the whole community is asking for rain, and there's an increasing sequence of fasts that are more and more severe. Now, what happens if you arrive at the end of the rainy season, at the month of Nisan, and rain still hasn't come? And this is where the first chapter concludes, and it says, Yatsa Nisan velo yardu gshamim, siman klala. So if it's the end of Nisan and rain still hasn't come, and then rain starts falling after that, then even though rain in general is a blessing, rain that is not at the right time is considered a curse. Okay, so we have again this idea, I'm trying to scroll down so you can see it. Here, you can see it here. So it's also a curse. Okay, so there's a very specific idea that rain is a form of communication. Rain has to come at a specific time. If it doesn't come at that specific time, then it's a curse. And that allows people, the community at large, to kind of read God's will, right? And to understand that God is the one who brings rain. And this is something that is only in God's hands. And it's a form of communication to the people of Israel. And this idea is expressed very explicitly right at the beginning of the Masechet in the Babylonian Talmud, in the words of Rabbi Yochanan, who says, "Shlosha maftichot biyado shel hakadosh baruch hu shelo nimseru biyad shaliach." There are three keys in the hand of the Holy and Blessed One, which were not given to a messenger or to an intermediary. Ve'elu hen maftach shel gshamim umaftach shel chaya. So there's three keys that God holds very, very close to his chest, and he doesn't want to give them to anybody else. And these are the key of rain, the key of giving birth, and the key of the resurrection of the dead. And note that all three things, what do they have in common? These are all things that have to do with giving life, right? So the very fundamental element of giving life to the world is something that God wants to keep in his own hands, because this is his way of messaging to the world and sending a message to the world. So the structure of the whole tractate, I think, is really built according to this logic that there's a specific procedure in which to request rain, and if rain doesn't come, then the people of Israel are supposed to understand that as a message, and they're supposed to fast and do tshuva. And this is what structures the procedure of how they're supposed to behave in the time of drought. So chapter 1 discusses, when you ask for rain, but then also what happens if rain doesn't come, and the progression of the fasts if rain doesn't come. Then chapter 2 discusses the most severe kinds of fast, where the whole community is fasting together, and it talks about all the different practices which make this a special fast, how they take out the ark to the piazza, to the streets, out of the synagogue, how they put dust and on their ashes on their heads, special prayers. Instead of 18 blessings in Shmoneh Esrei, there's 24 blessings. And then what's interesting is that in chapter 3, it seems like this idea is expanded to discuss not only drought, not only a prevention of rain, but in general, all kinds of calamities that can happen in the natural order. So there could be earthquakes, there could be different kinds of diseases that attack the animals. There could be ships that are shipwrecked at sea. So it seems like an extension of the same idea that God is communicating through nature. But what's very interesting in this chapter is that we begin to hear more about how different groups are supposed to respond to these calamities. So what happens, for instance, if a calamity befalls a certain community in a certain town, but what does that mean for the town next door? Does the town next door also need to pray for that, for the calamity happening in the other community? What happens if we know that there's a sea, we know that there's a ship adrift at sea with Jews on it? They're not part of our community, but we know about it. We're on dry ground. Do we need to pray for those people? So this issue of solidarity becomes a significant issue in the third chapter in the Mishnah, and we'll see in a moment how it's developed in the Talmud. I just want to end by saying that chapter 4 discusses the fact that we don't fast only for on an ad hoc basis to respond to calamities or droughts, but there's also specific days on the Jewish calendar that have already been instated as fasts, and the background for all of these fasts is also something that has to do with national events or national history. So it extends, I think, this idea of solidarity that begins to emerge in chapter 4. So there's a progression within the tractate from, first of all, talking specifically about rain to broader issues, but also from a kind of vertical axis of just God is communicating and the people need to understand what the communication is, to a more horizontal axis, which has to do with what is coming together in prayer and in fasting mean for the community as a whole. And I think that this idea is really developed especially in chapter 3 in the Gemara. That chapter is sometimes called Pirka de Chasidei, okay, the chapter of the Hasidim, because it describes many, many stories of different people who prayed and tried to bring rain. And what's interesting, I think, is that the chapter actually ends up focusing on some unknown characters who managed to bring rain where the great rabbis can't bring rain. And when they're asked, what are the good deeds that you do? Why were you able to bring rain where great rabbis like Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi or the Amora Rav were not able to bring rain? Why were you, the simple people, able to bring rain? Then the answers that they give all have to do with this issue of solidarity as well. One of them says, I live in a very impoverished place where people don't have money for Kiddush and Havdalah. So I make sure that people will have wine for Kiddush and Havdalah. And so they can all be Yotzei Yadei Chovah. They can all fulfill the mitzvah through my Kiddush and Havdalah. And the other one says, the other simple man who managed to bring rain says, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher of elementary school children. And I make sure that everyone in the community, whether they're rich or they're poor, they can all send their children and learn Torah. So what emerges, I think, from those stories, as well as many other stories in that chapter, is that the keys of rain are actually not only in God's hands, right? In contrast to what we see in the biblical picture, and maybe also in the structuring of the Mishnah and at the beginning of the Masechet in the Bavli, where Rabbi Yochanan says explicitly that the keys of rain are in God's hands, as the Masechet progresses, we see that actually what becomes more important for bringing rain is the capacity to see oneself as part of a community and to have solidarity with that community. And that's actually what God is waiting for. God is actually waiting for people to look to their right and their left, to pay attention to the other people who are standing around them or who are part of their community, and to care for those people. And God, in a way, mirrors that behavior. When he sees other people caring and being concerned for the welfare of the other people around them, that's what causes God to open the skies and to send rain and to care for the people as a whole. So we have both the vertical access of God with the keys of rain, opening the skies for the people, but also the horizontal access of communal solidarity also being one of the keys of rain for opening the skies. So we'll see that tension a lot throughout the Masechet, and in a way it continues what Michelle and Elana were talking about the individual versus the community in these tractates.
Wow, thank you, Ayelet. It's really special to be able to each speak about something similar and each kind of tackle it in a very different manner. So thank you for being with us. I would like to now introduce Mira Shapiro, who is an exceptional young woman who studied in Mayanot High School and is now learning her first year out of high school in SK Beit Midrash Migdal Oz. And I had the pleasure of spending Shabbat with her a few weeks ago. And hopefully she'll be staying in Israel, which will be great. And we'd like to hear from her. She's been learning the daf, and we'd like to have her share some thoughts with us.
Hi, thank you so much, Rabbanit Farber, for asking me to speak. This is really a crazy opportunity, and thank you everyone here. I can't believe that I get to kind of represent the Hadran learners at the Siyum. This is an amazing community, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But I want to go back to the narrow end of the shofar. We're all taking apart the shofar today, I guess. But I want to talk a little bit about like mindfulness and preparation before we do mitzvot and before we practice halacha, and kind of how that connects to my doing the daf, and I assume to a lot of other people on the student experience doing the daf. As Rabbanit Farber talked about before, our Masechet ends with Rabbi Elazar talking about how a person should arrange his tefillot before he says that. So for me, I feel like it probably means like reading the English and then actually davening the Hebrew. That's kind of what I think it means. And what Rabbanit Farber said was that it's about like they physically didn't have a book even to learn, so they really had to think about it before they did it. And I think that's definitely the pshat. But I also think that we see here and in a few other places in the Masechet, in fact, I think it's a theme throughout, this idea of preparation, of taking the time out of your day to think about Hashem, think about Torah, think about halacha before you do that, and that for that to be part of your service and part of your practice. And in the very end, like we were saying before, we end with, if you're standing behind the Kohanim, then you don't get their bracha for your Kohanim. And again, I think that's the same idea of mindfulness, of really being present. Just hearing it isn't enough. You need to actually make the effort to be listening and to be part of the tzibor. And then we have earlier in the Masechet even just the idea of can you hear multiple shofar blasts at once, right? We start off with asking that question, and then we talk about well, Hashem said Shemor and Zachor at Har Sinai, but that's not something that we can do. We can't say two things at once, and we can't generally hear two things at once. And then we go on to say later that you can hear 9 separate shofar blasts throughout the day, and that you're yotzei from that because you're focusing on each one individually. But if you want 9 people to come into a room and blow all at once for you, you're not going to be yotzei. That's not enough. So I think we really see throughout the Masechet this idea of focusing, even with the Eidim. We had the sugya where the Eidim like saw the moon, but then in order to have the kavanah to actually be Eidim, they have to go look again, and they have to really see it, and is it actually a cloud and whatever, they have to do that extra step. And so I think that this is just a really big value of ours as Jews, and I think everyone in the Zoom who's doing Daf Yomi, specifically the people joining us today, because I think Daf Yomi for me is taking that time to prepare, to think about Torah every single day, and even to just I started learning Gemara in 9th grade, which I'm so thankful to my note for. And I know that's a lot earlier than a lot of women learn Gemara, but like, we're not given this background. We're not given Torah Shabbat Path from whatever 3rd grade when boys start learning it. And so for learning Daf Yomi for me is getting this basis and getting this background, reading the English before I can really dive in the Hebrew, but then obviously also it's Torah learning in and of itself. So I think we're getting a little bit of both there. And then, so that's something really big for me with Daf Yomi is getting that background, both in the knowledge and also in the structure of the Gemara. I don't know about everyone else here, but like for me, it really took like a Masechta. I started with Brachot, I started this last cycle, and like it really took an entire Masechta to really know, like to really start to get into the structure. And like I see this munach, which means that this question is coming next. I see this thing, which means this is coming next. But I think that's something that doing Daf Yomi really gives us, and it's insane. It's incredible to be able to say that we can do that more than we used to be able to. But then even more than that also is joining a community of Jews and of women who value this, right? Like we're talking about before, like, is it there, like what are our values? And there are other, like Elana, Stein, Hain talks about other values that come out of maybe not talking about it like this, but for us, the community of women here who spend however long a day, whatever, 45 minutes, an hour a day, really learning and building each other up. It's incredible knowing that every day. I sometimes I like to learn like in the Gemara itself, sometimes I listen to the podcast, but knowing that like if I have a question, Rabbanit Farber is there. And knowing that like even just I could be sitting in the park or I could be sitting at the airport and like the person next to me will turn to me and be like, oh, I was just learning that. Let's have a conversation about that. It's incredible. It's insane. And I just have so much gratitude for this community that I get to be a part of, and for Hadran specifically for making this possible for all of us. So really mazel tov to everyone who is finishing this Masechta today, and hatzlacha in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meira. And thank you to everybody. As Meira said, thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Maggie Sandler for making the Siyum happen and everything else and all the back office of Hadran. And thank you to all our wonderful speakers. Thank you to all the wonderful women and men who came to share and celebrate. And thank you all for being part of this beautiful community, as we talked a lot about today, the importance of community. So thank you, everyone. Mazal tov. And thank you so much to all those who are part of our Ta'anit campaign to get more people to learn. In fact, many women signed up. And I would like to encourage you to continue.
And it's not too late to share it still.
Exactly. Yeah. Share the post, okay? Ta'anit, we're learning Ta'anit. Join us. Share it around. It's really getting a lot of, it's really the best Masechet to encourage people to start. And please share it around. We were blessed last night to have at the Siyum in Hebrew in Ranana, to have a woman who at the age of 70, almost 70, finished her first cycle of Shas. And it was a beautiful celebrating together with her. And she started at Masechet Ta'anit. And she also said what a great place it was to start. So please share around and get more people. We've learned that the best way to get people to learn Daf, it's hard to take that first step, but if you hear from someone else who's doing it, and if I think a lot of people said at the Siyum HaShas, they saw the women next to them who were standing up saying the Hadran, and that they had finished, and they said, if they could do it, then I can do it. So please pay it forward and pass it on to everyone. So thank you for all those who did, and thank you for all those who still will, and thank you all for coming, as always.
Mazal tov.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Mazel tov, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle, for all your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rabbanit Michelle. Mazal tov, everybody.
Mazal tov.
Go with everybody.
Thank you.
Toda rabba, mazal tov.
See you tomorrow, everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, see you
The
tonight.
Daf continues.
Tonight.
Love everyone.
Mazal tov, everybody. Such an honor to be in this community. Thank you. Mazel tov.
It's nice to see everybody's faces about once a month.
Maggie, where's the glasses?
I forget to put them on.
You can come to the shiur every morning. And then you can
Maggie's got some little kids at home who need some attention at that hour.
we forgive her.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't know how you fit in all the things that you do, Maggie. Amazing what you do.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Yasher koach to everybody. See you
Hi,
tonight.
everyone.
Bye.